Hi, I'm Lydia C., curator of Connecting Legacies here at the Asheville Art Museum. And we're going to take a little walk through the show. And I'm going to give you a little background on Black Mountain College and on the exhibition itself. But before we go into the show proper, I wanted to point out, as you enter the exhibition from the atrium of the Asheville Art Museum, this text is the first thing that you come into contact with. And this is a foreword from the first Black Mountain College catalog in 1933. And one of the things that's so wonderful about Black Mountain College is that they used, obviously, word of mouth and the mail to communicate with folks, but the way that they wrote about the philosophy of Black Mountain College and made their values as an organization, as an institution, open to folks was one of their incentives. Come here and we will have conversations about new methods of education. So we'll go into the exhibition and talk a little bit more about the work. So Connecting Legacies draws from the collection of Theodore Dreier, who was one of the co-founders of Black Mountain College. And a few years ago, the Dreier family donated a lot of Ted Dreier's archives, and archives are ephemera related to a particular subject matter. So in this case, the Dreier archives are letters, newspaper clippings, collections of records from the school that were his personal copies of things. So a lot of the materials that we have from Dreier have notes on them, or maybe it was a proof of a catalog or something like that. And so the goal of the exhibition was to take objects from the Dreier collection of the archive and set them up in a series of vignettes to talk a little bit more about the values and cultural concepts of the school, using the archival ephemera to fill in the gaps between the artworks that the Asheville Art Museum has in the collection, as well as to tell a little bit of a broader story, particularly a story focused on the women and people of color and potential gender minorities, although we don't have a lot of primary source and tangible material about that. But folks who are at the college who are often left out of the dominant conversations of the big name famous people who ended up there. The ephemeral and archival materials in this case detail kind of the early years of Black Mountain College, starting with the Rollins College Report, which details all of the offenses, many of the offenses that John Andrew Rice was kicked out of faculty at Rollins College for, which included pairing up male and female students to work on projects together, as well as wearing a jockstrap on the beach and calling a chisel a beautiful art object. So Black Mountain College was founded because John Andrew Rice was too radical for Rollins, and when he was fired, he left with several faculty members and students who ultimately helped him found Black Mountain College. And what we also see here, the work camp, the building project, and Lake Eden Inn and Cottages, when Black Mountain College started, they were using the YMCA Blue Ridge Assembly building during the off season. And it was inconvenient, and they didn't have full function of the campus, and they wanted to invest in a more permanent home. They were able to buy the Lake Eden property, but for the first several years of owning the property, they had to fund all of the work on the property that needed to be done, as well as building of new structures for faculty and students. And so what you see here is an advertisement for renting the property as like a summer vacation cottage. And some other propaganda here about, we the students, we need your help now, this is what we're doing, this is what your money will help buy. This magazine article that's kind of these overly staged photographs of all of the cool things that we're doing to try to incentivize donors as well as student and faculty participation. So many of these images seem kind of staged and silly, but they are a relatively good depiction of what the daily life involved, which was students and faculty meeting and having classes, the design of the new studies building, the construction that the students themselves were actually doing. The buildings were all constructed primarily by students with often just one certified contractor on premise. And then, of course, like the designs for the new studies building were done by Lawrence Coker. And then somewhere in here is actually a photograph of Ted Dreier. Yep, right here in the middle. The gentleman standing with the paperwork is Theodore Dreier, whose archival collection we are looking at. So while this was kind of an advertorial in a magazine, it is giving you a nice cross-section of daily life. So what we have here are the first 10 years of the Black Mountain College catalog. So 1933 to 1942-43. The first catalog here that doesn't have the emblem on it is the catalog that segment that I showed at the beginning came from, which was essentially the coming out of Black Mountain College, the announcement of it, not just as an abstract philosophy, but a tangible place where one could enroll as a student or be invited as faculty. And then some of the folks that we see up here on the wall, what we've done in our arrangement is situated three of the really powerful and somewhat undersung heroes who are female at the college. Ruth Asawa here in the center gained a little bit more notoriety in, say, the past 20, 25 years. In fact, in the last year, 2 books have been published about her that are phenomenal. And she started as a teenager at Black Mountain College, and we'll see a few more of her pieces later on. But she was actually in a Japanese work camp in California immediately prior to coming to Black Mountain College. And she was at the college early on and was among one of the first people of color to be at the school as a student. Later on, we have some famous folks like Jacob Lawrence ended up teaching at the college. But also in between there, the college was integrated the summer of 1944, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. On the right, we see MC Richards, and MC came to teach literature and writing. She was a translator and a poet and a writer, and she actually found ceramics at Black Mountain College and ended up doing ceramics for the remainder of her life and became a very iconic figure in writing about ceramics and writing as a process of centering. One of her most iconic books is called Centering. And of course, there are many overlaps between the concept of centering pottery on a wheel and also centering oneself. And MC is just a phenomenal thinker and writer and transmitter of somatic messages. And I think that a lot of what became her most kind of like important aspects of her practice were really gestated at Black Mountain College. And then, of course, on the right up here, we have Barbara Morgan, and she's instructing someone on the use of a camera. And Barbara Morgan was at Black Mountain College for the Summer Institutes of, in 1944. She had come to visit the summer before and then was invited to come back and teach. And Barbara Morgan, it's interesting. She's very well known for her portraits of dancers like Martha Graham and Isadora Duncan, but often her time at Black Mountain College doesn't necessarily get talked about in, again, like the legacy of famous people. And as an educator, it was a huge opportunity for Black Mountain College to have her. They knew it was a really big deal. But people like Barbara Morgan, who were kind of mid-career and relatively well-known that came, brought clout to the school. But also, just like with MC Richards, maybe already had a practice that then evolved because of their time at Black Mountain College. And some of her images have become among the most recognizable images at Black Mountain College, even though she was only there for the summer and was a very short time. And then down below, we have, of course, the Alberses here. And this is a series, these two guys in the center, Lyle Bong and Felix Korinsky. And these were both students. And then on the right is a photograph by Jonathan Williams, who became famous as a poet and a writer. He's actually one of the few connections between Black Mountain College and Penland. He went to become an early artist in residence at Penland, not immediately after leaving Black Mountain College, but shortly thereafter, and built his life around North Carolina even after leaving Black Mountain College. But there are only a few kind of tenuous connections between Black Mountain College and Penland, which is a question that comes up a lot as well as John C. Campbell Folk School. And, if you're in the rural mountains of North Carolina in the middle of the last century, certainly there had to have been some overlap. But of course, geographic and topographic and transportation difficulties, as well as even just messaging, getting messages back and forth and knowing what's going on, would have been incredibly difficult. So that's been one of my kind of passion projects is as I'm doing BMC research, anytime there's a blip of a connection between any of the other craft and folk schools in the area, I always get really excited about that. And then the folks in the photograph are Robert Creeley and Dan Rice. And Robert Creeley has his own very iconic life. So one of the things that Jonathan Williams did was he would make these very performative theatrical photographs of folks at the college. And there's a really phenomenal collection of his work that is both like the mundane every day-to-day stuff, but also like a little bit fictionalized or dramatized or sensationalized. And so his photographs are always kind of funny, have a little bit of a sense of humor, but are also depicting people who have become important, which is really neat to have those images. So I call this like the student wall, right? The student area. And what we're looking at here is a collection on the wall. These are all artworks from the Asheville Art Museum collection. And they were all made by folks who were students at the time at Black Mountain College. And one of the really interesting things is, although we do have some works that we're aware of who made them, for instance, this beautiful weaving by Laura Cadden Lindenfeld, we know that she made that. But some of these other works, we don't actually know. They're just unknown student works. And they came to the museum in an estate collection by another artist or were gifts from people who were at the school. We'll talk a little bit later about Lorna Blaine Halper, but she actually, her entire collection is here. So there were a lot of works from other people and correspondence that came in that are not necessarily known, but we know it's student work. And so one of the really neat things is that when you start to look at things like these contrast study, line drawing pieces, or the color studies, or this textile study, you start to see the connections between the Métier studies, which Joseph Albers kind of famously brought with him from the Bauhaus. Joseph and Annie Albers were both in workshops at the Bauhaus, and the Métier studies and the weaving workshop were both results of their time at the college. But these works here are unknown students. Here, what we've done is we've arranged a photograph at the top, which is by Hazel Larson Archer. She started at Black Mountain College as a student. She was a student of Joseph Albers and his Métier studies, and she was really interested in learning from Albers, learning how to see, which was his whole bag. Not to teach your hand to do something, but to learn how to see differently. And famously, Hazel, in a story told by her daughter, would take students out, 10 students to the side of a barn, 10 students with the exact same type of camera, shooting the exact same side of the barn, and she expected that each of those students would come up with a completely different result photographing the same thing, because she encouraged people to see things as they are, not as things are, right? And so starting as a student, she became the first full-time faculty in photography, and then these images down below, which were done by Jackie Gurevich, are student work that was done while she was enrolled in a class with Hazel Larson Archer. And of course, you have the iconic kudzu, which if you live in Appalachia is ever present in your life. There's also an abstracted weaving loom here. And then the Mae West Mountain, which is the mountain that you can see across the lake from the campus. But all of this work is student work, and often the students used each other as influence. They drew and painted each other. They modeled for each other. So it was a very symbiotic kind of relationship between students and also faculty. They tried very hard to be non-hierarchical. So a lot of these folks were engaged in, even if they were in other disciplines, like non-artists, they would still be engaged in a Métier studies class. So what we try to do with the case here, and these objects in this archival case are all from the Ted Dreier collection, is we tried to pull out moments that kind of highlighted integration at Black Mountain College, as well as things that highlighted just the student happenings at the school. And so on the right here are two poems written by Ralph Tyler on the backs of music programs. So one could think that he was watching a music program and then inspired to write a poem. This prehistoric specimens wave evolutionary battle against modern neurotics was a football game that the students played during Thanksgiving. Here's a preliminary proof of the 1945 Summer Art Institute catalog, and so that is the copy that Ted Dreier would have received and added his edits to. And then on the left here, we have a few music programs from the summer of 1945 when Carol Bryce and Roland Hayes were both invited to be part of the Second Music Institute. Now, in the summer of 1944, Alma Stone Williams became the first African-American student invited to the Summer Music Institute. And then in the summer of 1945, several African-American musicians were invited to come teach as visiting faculty. And I just want to point out that those dates, 44 and 45, are 10 years before the historic Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case. And I think that it's really important to remember that not only is that pretty radical, but also we're in the American South, we're in a very rural area, and leading up to the decision to invite African Americans as faculty and students, the school underwent a lot of community conversations, and it is discussed. There's an archival document actually at App State that includes John Andrew Rice, who is one of the main founder, his writing on the decision whether to or not to integrate. And a lot of folks, when they read it, get kind of an uncomfortable feeling because it sounds like he was against integration. But the way he's discussing it is interpreted many different ways, but the way that I usually read it is that he was not against integration, he was concerned for the safety of the community. And there are a lot of complex and nuanced things that go into that, but to decide to invite individuals of color into rural Western North Carolina in 1944 and 45, everybody had to be on board or they couldn't do it for the safety of the entire community. And so I think it's really powerful that they did elect to do that 10 years before Brown versus Board of Education. But I want to read this excerpt from one of the inserts to the catalog, and this is from, I think, 1943. The college will continue its practice of accepting students and hiring faculty without regard to race, color, and religions. There are no quotas of any sort. Students and faculty have taken an active part in opposition to the discrimination hysteria, which plays such a destructive part in the life of the United States at this time. And so I want to point that out because that was over 60 years ago. And I think that it's significant that as non-hierarchical as possible institution in rural Western North Carolina kind of had it figured out over 60 years ago and was able to clearly articulate why they were making the decisions that they were making and why they believed that everyone, regardless of class or status or ethnicity or race or lived experience, was a valued member of their community. So that's heartening as well as a little bit disappointing, right, that we're still having these same conversations. So we can move on. So among many of the relationships that started at Black Mountain College, some were romantic and some were platonic, lifelong friendships. Famously, many people who went on to become really well-known or moderately known had lifelong relationships that started at Black Mountain College. One of these iconic relationships is actually Robert Rauschenberg followed Sue Weil to Black Mountain College, and they ended up getting married and having a baby together. And then he also met John Cage, and the rest of his crew through Black Mountain College channels. Robert Rauschenberg went on to become very famous, and Sue Weil had an incredible career but never reached the level of fame. But he never would have gone to Black Mountain College if it weren't for her. And we do have a Rauschenberg piece in the show, but he's over here. We don't need to talk about him because everybody talks about him. But one of the slightly lesser known but no less iconic relationships that started at Black Mountain College is the lifelong friendship between Ray Johnson and Lorna Blaine Halper. Now, Lorna Blaine gifted a bulk of her collection to the Asheville Art Museum, so a lot of the illustrations of hers and correspondence between her and Ray that we have is because of her collection. And so she has all of these really beautiful letters that she and Ray wrote to each other after she left Black Mountain College. And this one right here is really phenomenal. This is actually the letter that Ray wrote to Lorna immediately after her departure from Black Mountain College. You just left, and I am moving out of Schmidt's into your study. That window of yours does not close. You certainly left a lot of crap behind. So that relationship, supportive and silly and wonderful, just the letter writing between them went on for their entire lives. Unfortunately, Ray Johnson passed away in 1995, too young, but he is widely known as the father of mail art, M-A-I-L, not M-A-L-E. And so this is, you can see kind of in his early letter writing, there are some moments where he's written a normal letter, like just a text letter, but the envelopes themselves or the exterior of the letter are all decorated. And he started moving into this alter and return New York. He founded the New York Correspondence School. And so he would make these collages and send them through the mail to people and invite people to alter them and pass them on to other people. And that's kind of what he became known for, was this interventionist collage practice. And so over the years, they sent a lot of art back and forth. And then Lorna was a metal worker, a sculptor, a painter. She did pretty much everything. And these two illustrations of hers that are not dated, but are incredibly relevant to us right now. This illustration says, "What's wrong with this government? Thank you for a wonderful trip." And this one says, "This government is fine. Oh yeah?" And like I said, both of them had wonderful senses of humor and used art to communicate with people, but also to poke fun and be silly. And in the case of Ray, sometimes completely disconnected from reality in a really wonderfully unhinged kind of way. So continuing on in the theme of relationships at Black Mountain College, the ineffable Albers pair, Annie and Joseph Albers, came to Black Mountain College in 1933. They were invited by founder John Andrew Rice, and famously a letter was written by Rice inviting Joseph Albers to come and teach, to which Albers replied, "I don't speak any English." And John Andrew Rice wrote back and said, "Come anyway." And so there's a wonderful article from the Asheville Citizen-Times on their arrival in 1933, and it just says something to the effect of, "German couple to teach art near here," and there's a photograph of them like kind of shoved in a corner. It's just chef's kiss. So on the left here, Annie Albers and Joseph Albers, and obviously you can see as a couple and also as artists, they had major influence on each other's work. And during the time that Albers was teaching, for the first few years, Annie did most of his translation and then ultimately went on to start the weaving workshop. And both of them were involved in the Bauhaus in Germany, and Annie was Jewish. And so part of their emigration to the United States was because of her identity as a Jew. And also she had been building a career and had notoriety, but her ability to teach and start the weaving workshop at Black Mountain kind of really started the process of her becoming a well-known textile artist in the United States. prior to the textile movement in the 60s, textiles were still kind of considered functional craft, obviously often associated with women's work. And there was a huge movement in late 50s through the 60s that fiber was sculpture. And while Annie Albers mostly wove two-dimensional things, she kind of was a heavy influence in the development of textiles as a fine art form beyond just the functional craft. But their influence on Black Mountain College and also just on America was immense, and we are still teaching their methods in foundations classes in colleges and high schools all across the United States. They're still just a major part of art education. And part of that was, as I mentioned before, the idea that making art and having a creative practice was more related to how we see the world and interpret it rather than learning hard skills. And the métier studies and material studies were all based in the fungibility of material. How does material behave? And how can you work with that behavior and also manipulate that behavior to have materials become other things while also kind of responding to the integrity of the material itself. And so one of their students was Ruth Asawa, who we talked about earlier. And this object is quite possibly one of the first explorations that Ruth Asawa did in what would become her some of the work that she became most well known for, which was her, it's not really woven and it's not really knit. It's a looped wire structure. So it's kind of close to crochet. It's also, I don't know, the substrate, the wire loops once and then it loops onto itself, almost more like maybe a net. And so these wire sculptures that she was making here, you can see that the lower part is a single string of wire, like a single gauge. It's a slightly thinner gauge. And then up at the top is a slightly thicker gauge, and it's double layered. And so you can really see her starting to figure things out here. What you also see here is a screen tone or a zip-a-tone. It's kind of like a screen print on paper here. And obviously you can see, and this was made in 1951, so you can continue to see line work and volume evident in her work. And she also met her future husband at Black Mountain College, who then went on to become an architect. But when you look at these three pieces together, see the connection of how they treat line in these three pieces and their influence on each other. And as is the case for many of the relationships at Black Mountain College, these folks didn't know they were going to get married when they met, right? But they influenced each other's practice and they built a life together. And these folks as well met at the college, Elaine Schmidt, then Urbain, and John Urbain. John Urbain is possibly more well known for paintings and collages like this. And we have some more works of his in the Asheville Art Museum collection. And Elaine, you can see here, these two drawings are from later when she was like in the 80s. She was visiting Jacob Lawrence, and she was remembering Beth and Bob in drawing class, drawing workman's shoes. So these are her drawings of her recollections of her time at Black Mountain College with kind of journal entries. But here, from 1946, is a drawing of John Urbain, who would then become her husband. And boy, what a svelte depiction of the man that she was maybe falling in love with at this point, right? So these relationships, at the time, they were just classmates, or they were people that were artists that were learning about themselves, and then of course their careers were kind of completely affected by their time together at Black Mountain College. Many of these folks would start as students and move on to become faculty, like I talked about with Hazel Larson Archer. And so all of these folks here were engaged in that student to faculty development. And we have Joseph Fiore on the left, Pete Warren Jennerjohn in the middle, and Pete took over the métier studies, the art department from Albers when he left. And then on the right here, we have a painting by Leo Krikorian of Felix Kruwinski with himself, Krikorian, in the background. Um, and so, Fiore and Jenner John both became faculty after their time as students. Like I said, when Albers left in 1948, Pete took over his classes. Um, and he also collaborated a lot with his wife, Elizabeth Schmidt Jenner John, who is one of the students' works that we had seen earlier. And they made what was called the Light Sound Movement Workshop in 1949 and through 1951. And so that was kind of a time when the college was starting to become a little bit more multidisciplinary and experimental. So these ephemeral objects, also from the Dreier collection, are detailing some of the final years, or leading up to the final years of the closing of the college in 1957. And there was a lot more cross-pollination and interdisciplinary art making, more performance towards the end of the 40s and early 50s, the iconic Happening, and many of the most iconic summer institutes that have become relatively recognizable in photographs, because when people talk about Black Mountain College, they also often make a lot of years appear as if it happened at the same time. Like there's a very famous picture of Rauschenberg dressing up someone as a horse that happened one year, and then all of these other things. And so people often associate some of these most iconic moments like the Happening. But one of the neat things that started to happen too is that people who wouldn't necessarily consider themselves performers ended up being involved in theater productions. Like in this case, The Good and Obedient Young Man, a play in the Japanese manner, Robert Rauschenberg was performing. Ruth Asawa was also performing. And it was the costumes and sets were done by Susan and Bob, which would be Robert Rauschenberg and Sue Weil. So a lot of people got involved in all the different artistic disciplines, which of course ultimately ended up affecting their careers. A lot of people ask, why did the college close, and would it still be able to function now? Would it still be able to exist? And I think obviously the mismanagement of money and leadership towards the end certainly contributed to its demise. But also there's always been a question of whether Black Mountain College would really be able to be successful through the years, and if maybe some of the reason that its kind of enigmatic reputation was because it was ephemeral. And if, as has happened to many institutions over the years, the changes happen in such a way that the culture and the student population and the world as a whole kind of grow past the institution. And I hesitate to call Black Mountain College an institution, but there are so many questions about how and why the changes affected the longevity of the college, and nobody knows. And we can read all the primary source documents that we want, but again, primary sources and archives are all mediated by the people that receive them, the descriptions of processing archival items, the authorship of those things. If it's not done by somebody who was present at the moment, it's obviously a second or third degree reading of it, and archivists have a responsibility and value-based judgment on trying to keep themselves as neutral as possible, but neutrality also has its shortcomings as well. And so we can dream up all of the connections that we can by looking at the primary source documents, where things that we know to be true can be traced. So some of the artists who participated in this photography, painting, and dance summer program, the summer session in vital contemporary art forms, some of these artists are up on these walls. So we can use the archival documents to place ourselves in space and in context with artworks. But when it comes to the interpersonal and complicated relationships and the nuances, we can only do our best to cobble together our own feelings and understanding of this really powerful and enigmatic and galvanizing place and time, and learn from the materials that we do have and appreciate all of the things that we might never know.